Thank you all for being here, whether you're here virtually or in person. It's an honor to share my story and to just be here and talk with you guys. Ooh, I'm sorry. So and also just a trigger warning, I am going to be talking about some things that are hard to hear related to abuse and suicide and things like that. So I'll do my best to, I don't know, if you start to hear that and you need to leave, it's totally fine. And I am trying to give, the highlights, not the deep details. But anyway, so how do you begin talking about being born and raised in a fundamentalist Christian cult? I am still figuring out how to how to talk about it. And as a child, I didn't know I was in a cult. I loved my church growing up, and I felt deep belonging there, like I often did in my family. I believed the church was a uniquely amazing place where people did everything better and more legitimately. I believed the promises the leaders made to me about the church and about the nature of God. We were saving the world. Even those in my own religion were lost until they came through our doors and were baptized into our community. Everything I understood about myself, my family, the world was supported on the foundation of these promises. And I believed like a child believes, with complete trust, not knowing any better because I was just a kid. I was a kingdom kid. A kingdom kid was the name of the children's ministry in my church growing up. And after a while, the term became used to describe children who had been born and raised in the church, the International Churches of Christ. Are you a kingdom kid? Was a question that I got asked a lot. And a lot of people got asked a lot. Functionally, it was used to explain where one was in the ranking. If you were a kingdom kid, then there was more pressure on you to be better. And I was so proud to be a kingdom kid, and I couldn't wait to be a disciple. And so this talk is dedicated to my fellow kingdom kids, those who were born and raised in cultic groups, wherever you are. I hope this talk reminds you that you are innately important, interesting, and capable simply because of who you are, not because of what you are or aren't a part of. And I recently heard business owner and community leader Melba Wilson say, "The things that people hide from their stories, I speak out loud because they were stepping stones to where I am today." So I'm hoping to speak some of the quiet things out loud and create some agency out of the anguish of this experience. At 12, I was probably the most disillusioned I would ever be in the church. I was right on the cusp of the indoctrination process. Again, I wouldn't have called it that. I was excited to study the Bible. We had these 7 first principle studies, which our leader, Kip McKean, had created. And they were a series of studies that taught you about the Bible and salvation and his view of it, I guess. And as you did the lessons every week, and you had to get approval from your discipler who was assigned to you every week before moving on to the next lesson. And then at the end, you would get baptized. Hopefully, some people went through the studies several times before they were approved and they were ready to get baptized. Because of this system of, I thought I was going to study the Bible, I was going to get approval to get baptized, I was going to get baptized, I was going to do my best to be a good disciple, I was going to do what I was told, I was going to start dating with approval, I was going to maybe get married with approval, I was going to have kids if I had approval for that, and I was going to be a good disciple wife. And so that sort of precise predictability, I just thought I knew exactly how my life would turn out, and that made me feel unnaturally safe. Home life for me had its highs and lows. It wasn't perfect, but overall that framework of beliefs and the predictability was just very safe for me. But I would soon find out that life doesn't work that way. I remember being, again, I was 12 years old. I was sitting at my computer and I had a really close friend that I hadn't seen at church in a long time and in a few weeks. And I thought maybe somebody died or something in her family. So I messaged her on AIM. This was like 2012 or 2002, 2003. And I said, "Hey, where have you been?" And she quickly replied with this like air of, "I know something you don't know, and I feel really good about it," because that's how 12-year-olds are. She was like, "Oh, that's a cult, and we don't go there anymore because they steal people's money." And I just remember being like, what? I had never heard anything bad about my church at all. I mean, again, I thought we were like rescuing people and saving people. I didn't realize that we were harming them in great numbers. But I went on Google. Again, Google was like a new thing at this time, but immediately I went on Google and I found ICSA and I found information about my church on BBC News, on Fox News, on ABC. Inside Edition with Barbara Walters did a special on my church saying, "Is this a cult?" Which, if you have to ask, as we all know. Anyway, so anyway, my brain just kind of broke, and I don't know if anybody else has had this experience, but I didn't know how to exist. I had an existential crisis at 12 because everything, and I don't know if anybody has studied schemas and psychology, but all the schemas that I had built had been on top of this foundation of what I knew about the church and what they taught me about the world and about the nature of God. And all of that was related to everything else that I had learned and that I knew. And so it was like, again, I didn't know how to exist. What do I do with this information? And from there, everything just sort of fell apart continually. So a few months later, I experienced instances of abuse from a family member in my home. It wasn't malicious or even egregious, but it terrified and confused me. And my parents' response was almost as traumatizing as the events themselves, and I never felt safe in my home again. I thought my parents didn't care about me, and I thought I could never trust them again, and for a long time I didn't. So I had church gone, a safe home gone. A few months after that, and a lot of what was happening too with my parents is they didn't know what they were doing. They were a part of the Boston movement. They moved up to Boston to be a part of Kip McKean's church. They were a part of the International Churches of Christ for over 23 years. And when they left, I think they were also just deeply confused. But they were my parents, and so they were making a lot of decisions that they were doing their best with what they knew. But a lot of the decisions they made were not helpful. But I always say, at least they left. At least they left the cult. But anyway, soon after this, my parents decided to homeschool me and my siblings. After being public schooled for our entire lives, they pulled us out of school in the middle of 7th grade to prepare for moving to New York City. So I was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, and at 13, I started the homeschooling. We were dropped off at the public library all day in the mornings. They both had full-time on-site jobs. My parents, they thought, I guess, again, that this would be better than going to public school in New York, or at least, I don't know, less scary. But yeah, so I was homeschooled. I was devastated by that. All the things that at least were a little bit familiar to me, right, were just being stripped away. And we moved to Washington Heights, Manhattan, which is also called the Little DR, the Little Dominican Republic. I thought I had moved to a different country. And yeah, everybody speaks Spanish there. It's very different than Nashville. And yeah, I was going through some things. And I think in all this too, my parents, they had left the ICOC, but because they were worried about me and my siblings' social life. When we moved up to New York, I had a friend that I'd met from camp that lived in New York and went to the New York City Church of Christ. So they allowed us to continue going to the teen ministry, is what it was called, the youth group at the International Churches of Christ, even though they had left that church for valid reasons and knew it probably wasn't the best, right? So I was going to that church, and I remember I was still going there, and I still wasn't, I knew my parents had left, so I knew I was starting to get the idea that, this wasn't a good place. But I still didn't know even when I read on Google that it had been accused of being a cult, I didn't know what that meant. I wasn't as sold on that. I didn't understand that in the way that I do now. So anyway, we were, a few things had happened to some friends of mine during this time that, again, helped me more clearly see that this was not a healthy environment. And what's interesting is that my parents, around this time, they also started attending another church, a healthy church community. We were going there on Sundays, and we were going to the ICOC on Wednesdays. And I was 15 years old, and it was palpable, the difference in just in the environment, in the air. Like, there was no hierarchy in this new church. There was no, I was treated with dignity. I was the only teenager there, but I was treated just like anybody else. And there was no pressure or expectations placed on me. It was a healthy community. And so, yeah, it was very interesting going back and forth, and I started to see that this place was not healthy. I remember we were in the car on our way to the teen ministry, the youth group, one night, and I got a call from my best friend. And I had just moved to New York, so we would talk a lot, and so it wasn't unusual to get a call from her. But she called me, and she said, we're on in a U-Haul on our way to Missouri. And I said, I didn't know you guys were moving. And she said, yeah. She told me her stepdad, somebody that her mom had been arranged to be married to in the church, was physically and verbally abusive. And so they got all their stuff together while he was at work, and they left a note, and they got in a U-Haul, and they were on their way to Missouri. And I just remember crying. And naively, the first thing that came out of my mouth was, did the church know? Did they know? And she said, yeah, they just asked us to keep praying about it. And I cried the entire way to teen ministry, and when I got there, I was a very angry teenager. Another thing, similarly, a few months later, happened to a very close family friend that we had in the ICOC. I remember getting a message on MySpace or something from a friend. She said, hey, my dad has been missing for a few days. We don't know what's going on or what's happened. And, I was like, oh my gosh. And so these were my parents' best friends. And we were best friends with their kids. So we would go on vacation together sometimes, church vacation, conferences and things like that. And the next morning, my mom woke me up, and she said they found him, and he committed suicide. And I just remember thinking at 15, what if, and I want to say too that you never know what's going on in somebody's mind and heart and all the things that they're going through when they make that kind of decision, right? So I can't say one way or the other what was going on with him, but I remember thinking, what if they hadn't been a part of this community? Because I had seen a community that was so much healthier. I'd been at that point in a community just for even a few months that was so much healthier and better. And I couldn't stop asking myself that question. So anyway, as I was in Washington Heights being homeschooled, again, my parents had full-time jobs, so we were often left on our own during the day, and the education was not up to par, really. And I was very isolated and very confused. And I started to experience what I didn't know at the time, but what I later found out was OCD. So I had just had these debilitating, reoccurring thoughts. And I know a lot of it had to do with the social isolation. I was just alone by myself every day. Every morning I would just get up and leave my apartment and walk around Washington Heights because it felt safer than my home at the time. Yeah, I didn't realize that that's what I was experiencing, but I was still going to this new church, and I did not like this new church that I started going to. I thought it was weird. I hated it because in the ICOC, you were taught that other Christians are not real Christians. You're taught to look at them with, they're phonies. They would like raise their hands and during worship. And I was like, I've never done that. That's weird. Why aren't you clapping, So yeah, I started going to this church, and my parents dragged me. But after a while, I started listening to what the pastor said. And this is my story that I'm just sharing because this is my life, but I know everybody has a different story. But I started to listen to what the pastor was saying, and I realized functionally that this was a different religion. He said things like, there's nothing you can do to make God love you more. There's nothing you can do to make him love you less. He loves you perfectly and fully just as you are right now. And I remember thinking, God, I never heard that before, but that sounds nice. And again, I was treated with dignity in this church. There was no hierarchy. There was no power dynamics. I was the only teenager there, but people treated me just like any other adult there. And there wasn't any pressure or expectations placed on me. I went when I wanted to go, and I left when I wanted to leave. And sometimes I didn't go at all because I couldn't. And for many years, I would go, and I wasn't very involved. I just would go to just listen, but not engage and participate. But anyway, at 16, I started to realize that if I had stayed in the ICOC, I would have friends. I would have community, and I would have this deep need to belong. It would have been fulfilled in me. But I also knew that was ultimately empty because it was conditional, coercive, and formulaic. It would have been a false belonging. And I knew even at 16 it was better to be lonely and out of the ICOC than to have friends and community and be in the ICOC. And so as I was listening to these sermons and starting to, I guess, come to my own understanding of what I believed and shed off the toxic, harmful things that I grew up hearing, I decided to get baptized in this new church. And I remember like checking off this little thing that said like, do you want to talk to somebody about baptism? And I was like, yes, I do. And also what's funny is that before that, even there were 2 services at the church, and my parents would drag me to drag us, the whole family, to the first service. And then they had an afternoon service. And I would tell my parents like, bye. I would be like, I'm just going to hang out and maybe go to like Barnes and Noble or whatever. And they'd be like, okay, just let us know when you're coming home. And I would go to the second service on my own because I did not trust my parents at all. I was actually even angry that I liked what I was hearing from the sermons. I was like, I needed like a separate, ness from them. But yeah, I remember meeting with one of the pastors there who became somebody who I deeply trusted and was mentored by, a wonderful, wonderful human being. I remember him telling me about baptism, and he was like, oh, it's a symbol, and it's, we do it because we read about it in the Bible, and it's a symbol of God's covenant to us. And he was like, some people are getting baptized next week at the beach. You want to come? If that's something you want to do. And I remember being like, yes, because I do believe this. And so that's what I did. And it was that simple. It was like, do you believe this? Yeah, okay, so let's go. And that's all it was. And I remember that week too, I had gone to the ICOC teen ministry, and I told them I had gotten baptized, and they looked at me like I had a third eye. And that was the last service I ever went to. Because I was like, I'm not going to be understood here. I'm not going to be welcome here. And again, I want to say that this is my story, and I totally understand anybody else's story. Everybody's story is valid. And I'm just sharing my own. And I'll even say too that, where was sorry. I wrote some notes down and I lost my place. But yeah, I wanted to share two things too that I think, one thing that really helped me when I was experiencing this new church is, I think the deepest reason that I converted to Christianity in that church, because again, it was functionally a different religion that I was experiencing in this church, was that I felt seen and heard in my pain. I had debilitating OCD. I was extremely isolated. I don't think anybody at the church, except for this one pastor that I mentioned and a few other people, even knew that I was on my own every day. But I heard the pastor say once, he was talking about, New York can be filled with so many people, and yet you can still feel so alone in the midst. And he quoted Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where it's about a captain that his ship gets lost at sea, and there's water coming into the ship, and it's just chaos. And at one point he says, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. And I was like, yes, that's how I feel. And another thing too that he quoted was Pearl S. Buck. He said, the person who tries to live alone will not succeed as a human being. His heart withers if it does not answer another heart, and his mind shrinks away if he hears only the echoes of his own thoughts and finds no other inspiration. And I think it moved me so much because at that time I was trying to live alone. I didn't trust anybody, and I was kind of going crazy because of the isolation and my inability to trust anyone. And yeah, okay, I'm back to where I wanted to be. But so even now I believe differently than I did then. I just wanted to say that. And today I would also say I have more doubts than beliefs, but I still call myself a Christian. But anyway, hearing these things helped me feel seen. And finally, I had some conversations with my parents. They sent me to a therapist and eventually a psychiatrist who diagnosed me with OCD and severe depression and put me on medication that saved my life. And so I wanted to tie this all together with a few points about my journey. And this is just, again, the highlights. I'm probably going to write a book one day, hopefully. But I think probably my main point is that finding belonging within myself and finding my own sense of self apart from anyone or any group has been a huge part of my recovery. And I would say has been the first step in allowing myself to healthily belong to others. One of my favorite authors, Henri Nouwen, said, when we do not protect with great care our own inner mystery, we will never be able to form community. So even as you share your own story, you don't have to share all of it. And my second point is one of my favorite psychologists, Dr. Dan Siegel. He's a child psychologist. He said, it is not what happened to you as a child that matters. It's how you make sense of what happened to you. And so reframing your narrative about who you are is important and powerful. And every part of your journey, I think, can be understood in a way that supports you and can be a stepping stone. And I'm not saying that too as if I understand everything that happened to me perfectly, and that I'm giving everything that happened to me meaning, because I don't think that that can be true for every single thing we go through. But over the years, as I've shared my story, it's changed because I've been able to see it with new information and new perspective. And as you share your story, it will too. And that's normal and that's healthy. And you get to decide what parts of your story you share and who you share them with and when. And so I'll give you 3, I guess, shifts that I had and what had happened to me and the beliefs I had about myself that changed once with time and with healing. So how my parents handled my abuse. I thought that they didn't care about me. But as I grew, as I brought them into therapy with me and I had hard conversations with them, and I learned about the system that I grew up in, and in particular in the ICOC, how they talk about sex and make rules around sex and don't talk about abuse, that my parents just didn't know how to respond and didn't know how to make sure I felt safe in an appropriate way, and didn't know how to help my other family member. And again, a lot of that was due to what they had learned in the church or not learned. My initial narrative with my OCD was that I believed the obsessions that I was having. They were, again, debilitating. I thought I was a monster. And I just had such a hard time with that. But when I learned what I had, that I had OCD, it changed everything. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a thing. This is not who I am. This is something happening to me. And I also, yes, I also wanted to say too that I flunked out of college in my 3rd semester of college. And I was devastated by that. I was in a small liberal arts Christian college, and for the first time, I was around people that were my age and believed some of the same things that I did. I felt like I finally found community and belonging in a healthy space, and in a lot of ways, I did. And I wanted to be a professor, and I wanted to teach. And I flunked out my 3rd semester. And I used to blame myself for that so much. I'm an idiot. I couldn't keep up with the work, blah, 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 blah. But as time and education and all that has happened, I've realized that I had a neglectful education in high school, severely neglectful education. Again, my parents were doing their best with what they knew, but they bought some online program that ended up not being accredited in New York, and I had to get my GED, and it was very neglectful. So I just wasn't prepared for the workload, and I wasn't set up to have a successful college education and experience. And I think the big thing with this is that recovering from cult abuse is a long process of grief that will never completely go away. And I think, what do they say? Like, grief never goes away, but it changes shape. So that has been my experience. And I wanted to end on a funny note because my mom has often said, well, you can't blame everything on the church. And I would like to say, when you've grown up in a cult, you can. Thank you.